So, hello everyone, it's Susan Rochester here from Balance at Work, and I'm so happy you could join me for today's webinar. Today we're looking at top tips for interviewing candidates. There's going to be a lot of information in this. I realised when I was putting this all together just how many years actually I've been doing this, writing about it, talking about it, giving seminars, and I have so much information to share with you that I'm hoping we can pack it into the half hour that I promised this webinar would go for. So let's get started. This is what's on our agenda today. I'd like to start by giving us a bit of context about interviewing and why interviews and getting them right are so important. Then we're going to look at how you prepare for your interview, a very important step. What's the purpose of the interview? What's your process? And you may remember when you registered, you had the opportunity to ask some questions, and a few people did ask questions, and I'm going to be looking at those. I've also have an offer for you as a thanks for attending the webinar, and we'll be talking about that a bit later too. So if you're happy with that, let's dive in. Now this is a quote from Jim Collins in Good to Great, which I always think of when I'm thinking about recruiting and managing people well. And obviously interviewing is one part of, and a very important part, of getting the right people onto your bus. A few weeks back I did the first webinar ever, so this is my second ever, which was about how to make your good team great. And in that we looked at 3 steps: designing the team, combining the right people and refining them. So obviously today we're drilling down further on combining and how interviewing plays an important part in getting the right people on board your bus. Just to put things in a bit of perspective, this is an article I ripped out of the Fin Review a few years back, but the thing I'd really like to point out to you is that last point under the key points. So many SME employees, 8%, decide to quit on their first day. And there's been research done about why you might get high turnover and how this relates to your selection process. And there's 3 reasons. One is lack of consistent evidence-based selection process. The second is relying on the candidate's description of themselves instead of evidence. And the third is that the job's not necessarily described accurately to the candidate. So you can see those things all relate to how you interview and how you do it well. And obviously if you get it wrong, that high turnover is going to cost you a lot in terms of time and money. So it's really worth putting in the effort and the time to get your interviews right. Just to give you a bit of external context, we're now appear to be entering another period of skills shortage. That means that candidates are going to be harder to find. It may also mean that your own staff are leaving and you find yourself interviewing when you haven't had to do that for a while. The reason for this is our current unemployment rate. This is up until the end of the June quarter this year. It's gone up a bit since then, but the main thing to take from this is that we're close to full employment, and that means every time you interview someone you want to know you're doing it for the right reasons and you're following a procedure. One more point though, in these times it's important not to be tempted to oversell a position, because what you say to somebody in an interview may form part of a contract if you eventually employ them. So although part of your interview process is to sell the job and the role, don't oversell. Okay, so I'd like to see your recruitment process as a bit of a funnel. So when by the time we've got to the interview stage, we've got these people, well, they look like people who've dropped out at the bottom, who we're now ready to interview. So what extra information do you want to know when you get them in from the interview? Your funnel up to this stage has been probably your selection criteria in your advertisement, deciding whether their resumes show that they're worthwhile applicants, and possibly you've used a recruitment agency. So they've come through the funnel, you've got this smaller group of people that you now wish to interview. So these are the sort of things that an interview can draw out, in addition to what you've already seen in the resume. Just before we move into the face-to-face interview, I just wanted to point out that you don't have to feel obliged to start your first conversation with a person, a candidate, as a face-to-face interview. In fact, a telephone interview can be a great screening tool. I don't know if any of you have used this in the past, but I would recommend that you consider it in terms of saving time and saving money. So what are we going to do in the telephone interview? Obviously you have your essential criteria for the role, so this is a great way for you to check that the person that you're talking to actually meets the essential criteria. You're also going to check that they have some understanding of what the role involves and what working for your organisation involves. Obviously, while you're talking on the telephone, you're also checking on their communication skills. And finally, it's a way of really understanding how much they wish to, how committed they are, I guess, to applying for this role. So I would really recommend that before you go to face-to-face interview, unless it's easy for you to do that, that you go straight to a telephone interview. You can cut down a lot of time for both yourself and the candidate. Having said that, we all use face-to-face interviews, and the next section and the main part of this webinar is talking about the preparation, the purpose of the interview, and then we'll spend a lot of time on process. So let's start by looking at your preparation. There are certain things that you need to do when you're preparing for an interview, and I'm sure you're all aware of that. The first of those is to schedule, and that includes not only scheduling when you'll carry out the interviews, but scheduling within the interview how much time you think you need to spend on each part of the interview, and very importantly, scheduling for yourself adequate breaks between the interviews. There's nothing worse, and I'm sure anyone who's done this will agree with me, there's nothing worse than having back-to-back interviews and then getting to the end of the day and thinking, who was that again? So you really need time to look at your notes and summarise where you're up to with the different candidates. So leave yourself a gap in the schedule to do that. As part of your preparation, you need to set out an agenda which essentially becomes your script for the interview, and you'll be getting a lot of good information in the next couple of sections that can really form an interview plan for you. Obviously you want to have an appropriate venue that's private and where you're not likely to be interrupted, comfortable, etc. And then the final step is you're going to invite those people you want to interview. As well as inviting candidates to interview, I think you should also consider whether you want someone else to sit in on the interviews with you. Now, for more senior roles, obviously you probably have a panel, or at least a couple of people who will be doing the interview. But consider it even for more junior roles such as customer support or the back office roles, where you might be able to use a person who would be a peer of the new employee. For more senior roles, I'd even consider bringing in a customer, one of your top clients who knows the business well, who may have business experience themselves and have experience at interviewing. Now, there's a big advantage in having more than one person interviewing. Well, there's a couple of big advantages, but one of those is overcoming the bias that one person might have. So you're able to get another person's point of view on the candidate. But the other advantage that I've noticed in interviews is that if you're taking turns in answering questions, it gives each person a chance to observe how the interviewee handles the questions, get a much better feel for that person through observing their body language, etc. So as part of your agenda, I just wanted to show you a couple of ideas for things that you might put in there. We will talk about the actual agenda itself, but within the question part of it, consider having a list of your questions with space to write notes. You can see here that I've also got a box for a rating. So what does that mean? Well, it's the rating that you give to the candidate's answer, and this is an example of one rating scale that I've used in the past and continue to use. 5 points is probably more than adequate. Some people prefer to give them a mark out of 10, and that's also a good idea. However, I find with the 5 points you're limited to choosing a specific score that matches them rather than being a bit wishy-washy. Okay, so just a couple of tips there. Now let's look at what is the actual purpose of an interview. Well, I believe there's 3 main things you're doing when you're interviewing someone. The interview should let you know, or give you a better idea of whether they can do the job, but you also would like to know, will they do the job? We all know ourselves that there's a difference between what we can do and what we enjoy doing. And the other main purpose of the interview is really looking at how well that person is going to fit into your team. Now, this is a diagram that you might have seen before in covering eligibility and suitability, the 2 main things that we're looking for when we're employing somebody. As I said in the previous slide, the can do and the will do or want to do. So if you look at the can do, they're generally the things that you're looking for in the resume, aren't they? However, the suitability, the will do things, are things that we can use an interview to find out more information. So what's your process going to be? For clear-cut steps, your opening, your questions, the close and the follow-up. Now we're now going to go through each of those steps in detail, one by one. There's going to be a lot of detail, and if you pay attention, this is really, you can use this information to build your interview plan. So step 1 is where we open the interview. You want to welcome the candidate, introduce yourself and the organisation, obviously introduce others who may be there as part of the interview and why they're there. Explain the purpose of the interview. What are you hoping to get out of the interview today? Outline your agenda for the interview. Indicate to them that you're going to be taking notes, and also let them know that questions will be welcome. And of course this is the time to say, you know, we'll be happy to answer questions at the end, or indicate that there will be that opportunity at least. So when you're opening the interview, it's really all about establishing rapport and setting expectations for the interviewee so they know what's going to come next. It's important throughout the interview, I think anyway, that you keep in mind some do's and don'ts. And here are my don'ts to start off with. Don't get distracted. There's nothing more off-putting to someone who's answering a question to feel that you're not actually listening to them. Don't jump to conclusions. I know this is very easy to do, and it's actually how our brain works and takes shortcuts. But you really need to give the person you're interviewing a chance to respond in a way that's going to help them. Don't use closed questions. I'm sure you all know your closed and open questions from sales training and things like that. Obviously, a closed question is one that requires a yes or no answer, and occasionally they're appropriate. But in an interview, situation, we're mainly using open questions. Don't ask irrelevant questions. Whatever you do, don't talk more than the candidate. It's their job to sell you, not the other way around. And preferably don't use jargon that they might not understand. Although, of course, using jargon is appropriate if you're trying to assess somebody's knowledge. So they're all the don'ts. What do you do? Obviously, plan appropriate questions. Make sure that they're consistent for all people that you're interviewing. Listen carefully and take notes. It's often hard to remember from one interview to the next what people said, so I really do recommend taking notes. Know what you're looking for. Know what's essential for this role and what's desirable, which I'm not going to go into here, but that's something that you've done way back before you've even advertised the role. Ask for more information if you need it. So even though you have your set questions, that doesn't mean that you can't actually dig deeper to get the information that you want. Stay focused. Again, that's to do with listening carefully, and get help when you need it. That refers, of course, to getting other people to come in on your interview. Okay. So you've opened the interview and you're now ready to start questioning. And in this next part, we're going to take a close look at different types of questions and examples of those questions. So we'll start first with the least effective questions. And I would put in this group questions that are predictable. And because they're predictable, they're going to be easy for the candidate to prepare. And an example of that is the good old, where do you plan to be 5 years from now? And the reason these are least effective is because they don't really add to your useful knowledge about the candidate. Part of the reason for this is that a candidate who really wants the role is likely to be a lot better prepared and more motivated than you are to get it right when it comes to questioning. So questions need to be, I guess, a bit more incisive. So let's look at some moderately effective questions. These are questions that could be confusing to the candidate. They may not be entirely relevant. And one example would be, why did you move from company X to company Y? Especially if we're now on to companies Z and A, and it was quite a while in the past. These sort of questions could provide some insights, but you really need to be focused on what it is that you most need to know in order to know that that person can succeed in the role. So some examples of what I would call moderately effective questions are these, and their effectiveness will depend on just how useful the info is that you get when you ask the question. I guess the point I want to make here is we don't ask a question without knowing what it is you're looking for in your question. Okay, so our most effective questions are obviously going to fulfill your need for relevant insights, and I would say detailed insights. They're going to provide you with accurate information. They don't waste time for yourself or the interviewee. And they're going to be related directly to the task at hand, and your task at hand at this point is finding the best possible person to join your team, isn't it? So I'm sure you've all heard of behavioural interview questions. These are the questions that are judged to be most effective because past behaviour is the best predictor of future behaviour. And asking behavioural questions helps you get beyond first impressions and assess the likely fit of that person to the job, to the organisation, to your team. So we're looking specifically at past behaviour. So we're asking questions related to our selection criteria. So let's say, for example, this is a customer service role. Your behavioural question, or one of them, might be, tell me about a time when you've had to deal with a difficult customer. Or you could say, can you describe a situation where similar? And if they don't come forward with a full explanation, then you need to be asking questions like, how did you handle it? What was the outcome? What did you learn? And is there anything you'd do differently? I particularly like those last two because they give you a lot of information about the person and their willingness to learn from their experiences. Let's look at some examples of behavioural questions. You can see that these questions examine specific real experiences instead of theoretical scenarios. In the past, questions have often been asked along the lines of how would you handle a difficult client, rather than asking, using the customer service example, rather than asking for a specific description of a time that they've actually done that. By asking about scenarios and what would you do, all you're going to get is what they think's best practice, rather than getting an indication of what they've actually done in the past and what's worked and what hasn't worked. I hope you can see the distinction. Now, I did promise to look at the sorts of questions you shouldn't ask. These are some questions that I used recently in a presentation where I asked the audience, which of these questions would they ask in a job interview? And I must say I was a bit surprised at the responses I got, because some people thought that, these were quite good questions. Although, I had one person that said, oh, yeah, I wouldn't ask the second one. So, unfortunately, they're probably all questions that are best not used when you're interviewing. And there's two main reasons for that. One is that none of them really would contribute information to let you know how successful or how capable they are of doing the job. And the second one, and probably most important if you want to stay out of court or stay out of trouble, is that they can all be perceived as discriminatory questions. So please, please avoid. There's plenty of other questions you can ask. Of course, a question I'm often asked is, what if somebody volunteers the information, for example, that they've got 2 children in preschool? Well, there's nothing you can do about that. It's called that a bonus that you got that extra information in the interview. However, you can't actually ask it. Right, now before we move on to the next step in the process, I'd just like to tell you about an offer that I'm making in conjunction with the webinar. Last time when we did the team webinar, I offered this to participants and it was very popular, so I thought, why not also give you the opportunity to have a team health check. It's something that gives a lot of value to people to know what's really going on in their teams, and it's also a lot of fun for me to do because I like to help teams work better together. So a special price for today's webinar, and that's available if I get your request before next Tuesday. This week I actually completed a team health check for this client, for Bernie, for the 2nd year in a row. So if you can see that there'd be some value in that to you, I look forward to hearing from you. Right, our next step, step 3, is closing the interview. This is where you give the candidate an opportunity to ask questions. Whether or not they ask questions and the quality of the questions they ask are all useful information for you in terms of deciding whether this is the person for the job. While you've got them there, it's a good time to check documents such as their qualifications, evidence that they have the right to work in Australia, and also make sure you have the contact details of any referees. Always tell them at this stage what will happen next and let them know when you're going to make your decision. It's also a good idea to confirm that if they were successful in this interview, when would they be available to start? And of course, you're going to thank the interviewee. So how do we put it all together? I really strongly recommend, especially if you're interviewing several people, that you keep a summary sheet for each interviewee. This summary sheet is going to have your scores. Remember, we looked at the ratings before. So what are the ratings you gave them on each question? What would you say were their major strengths, their major challenges? And then give them an overall score for the interview. And often this is easy to say, somewhere between 1 and 10. This also makes it a lot easier for you to compare candidates, and probably just as useful is it's great for telling you what you need to check when you're checking referees. What questions should you probably be asking the referees? Step 4 then is post-interview, I guess. So you're going to do your pre-employment checks, and that might be a psychometric assessment, it might be a work test that you routinely use, and of course police checks, credit checks, anything like that. Reference checking is the next step, as we just mentioned, and the next essential step. And always advise interviewees of the progress, even if there hasn't been much progress. If you said you were going to call them by Friday, please call them by Friday. Likewise, let unsuccessful candidates know as soon as possible that they've been unsuccessful, and always be prepared to give feedback. I'm noticing over the years more and more now that both successful and unsuccessful interviewees are interested to know how they went in the interview and what their strengths were, etc., just for their own development. So, hopefully, if it all goes smoothly, at the end of that process of the 4 steps that I've just given you, you'll be prepared to make an offer to your ideal candidate and welcome them on board. Hooray! It really is worth it to get the right person, don't you think? Now, as I said, there were some questions that people entered when they registered, and these are the questions here that I was asked. You'll notice that the first 2 are very closely matched, and the last is about organisational culture fit, which of course is always an important factor. Just to give my input, and if there's time and if I can work out the technology, I may also ask you for any questions and input that you have around this. But I would say if you start, the best place to start is with your behavioural interview questions. So in terms of commitment, you might be asking, for example, tell me about a time when you went above and beyond the call of duty. And you have all the steps there in asking a behavioural interview question on what to dig for and what to look for in their answers. What else could you ask for in terms of commitment? I guess I'd certainly be asking their referees, what was this person's work attendance like? Did they tend to take much sick leave? Things like that. And reference checking is a very good one for checking their commitment as well as their performance. In terms of cultural fit, it's important to make sure that you're asking questions that relate to your specific culture. For example, if you have a team where people need to work very closely and together and cooperate closely together, you're going to be asking behavioural questions around that to get a real feel for their experience of that. Of course, another way that you can measure all these things is with the Harrison assessment, and if you'll indulge me in a couple of minutes, I'd just like to quickly go through and show you how that can help. Okay, so this is a job success formula, and we can set these up for your specific role, and you can see they're the sorts of traits that we can include in your formula for whatever role it is that you're looking at. Depending on, independent of what you put in there, this work preferences questionnaire is what the candidate sees. So they spend 20-30 minutes answering these questions, ranking these statements, as you can see there. Then we use that data to develop a report for you which will show you the job fit. And the job fit consists not just of their personality, but also their work preferences, their behavioural preferences, a whole range of things, as you can see here. So these were the essential traits chosen for this job, and we get here a lot of information about that person and what that's going to mean for them in that particular role and in the organisation. So for example, if you would prefer people to have a positive frame of mind, you might make an essential trait optimistic, and this assessment will measure that. So there we go, a bit more about desirable traits and whether this person is a good fit or not. I don't want to go into a lot of detail here, but if you're interested to know more, we do offer a free trial, so you can give me a call or visit the website and you'll find a link on the website to actually request a free trial for yourself. And it would be remiss of me not to remind you again of today's offer. But before you go, I would really like you to take some time now to just write down what's the main thing you can do that's going to make your next interview more effective. It's often quite easy to listen in on things like this, but not necessarily take some action, and I'm all for taking action. So if this presentation has caused you to change just one thing, then I will feel that I've achieved something today. And if you have any questions, I'm always happy to help. I'd really be interested to know how you go with any of this. Now, if you can bear with me for a moment, I'm going to switch off the recording